In the hushed, amber-lit sanctuary of Ethelgard, New York's most decorated temple of gastronomy, silence was the most expensive thing on the menu. It was a silence woven from old money, hushed negotiations, and the implicit understanding that anyone who had to ask the price of the Grand Cru Montrachet did not belong. Into this silence, Clara Hayes moved like a wraith, a ghost in a starched black uniform, her presence felt only by the timely appearance of a chilled water glass or the discreet removal of a finished plate. At 24, Clara had mastered the art of invisibility. It was a necessary skill, a survival tactic learned through years of navigating the treacherous currents of high-end service. To be seen was to be judged, and to be judged was to risk the tips that kept the lights on in her cramped Queen's apartment, and, more importantly, paid for the specialized memory care her mother, Eleanor, so desperately needed. Each polite nod, each perfectly poured glass of wine, was a brick in the wall of solvency she was trying to build around her crumbling family. Tonight, that wall felt particularly fragile. "Table 7 is yours, Hayes," Mr. Dubois, the floor manager, whispered, his voice a dry rustle of anxiety. He was a man perpetually coiled with tension, his French accent sharpening with every VIP arrival. "And for the love of God, be flawless. It's Caelan Vance." A cold stone settled in Clara's stomach. Caelan Vance, the tech wunderkind, the Silicon Alley disruptor who had become a billionaire before his 30th birthday. His company, Synapse, had created an app that monetized human memory, a digital scrapbook that predicted nostalgia. He was famous for two things: his almost supernatural ability to predict market trends, and his utter, undisguised contempt for anyone he deemed beneath him. He didn't just fire people, he eviscerated their careers, leaving a trail of scorched earth NDAs and broken professionals in his wake. "He's bringing the Ishikawa delegation," Dubois continued, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple, despite the room's cool temperature. "The deal is for their entire robotics division. Billions. If his stake is even 5 degrees off, don't just clock out. Evaporate." "I understand, Mr. Dubois," Clara said, her voice a calm facade over the frantic thrumming of her nerves. She picked up a linen cloth and gave the already gleaming silverware at table 7 a final, superfluous polish. She thought of her mother, of the last phone call from the facility director. "Her cognitive decline is accelerating, Ms. Hayes. We may need to discuss a more intensive level of care soon." More intensive meant more expensive. Failure tonight was not an option. Before her life had been derailed by her mother's illness and the mountain of debt it created, Clara had been on a different path. Her father, a cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, had raised her on a diet of Basho's poetry and Kurosawa's films. She hadn't just learned Japanese, she had inhaled it, lived it during the most formative years of her childhood. Their small apartment in Queens still held artifacts of that life, a worn copy of The Tale of Genji, a small, faded omamori charm for good health hanging by the door, a photo of a 7-year-old Clara in a tiny kimono, laughing under a blizzard of cherry blossoms with her father. Now, that language, that culture, felt like a relic from a forgotten civilization, a skill as useless as knowing how to fletch an arrow in the age of the algorithm. At precisely 8:00 p.m., the grand oak doors of Ethelgard swung open, and a shift in the room's gravitational field announced Caelan Vance's arrival. He was tall and lean, dressed in a stark, collarless black jacket that looked more like a costume from a sci-fi movie than a dinner suit. On his wrist was a custom-made digital watch with a frantic, pulsing display, a stark, vulgar contrast to the quiet elegance of the room. He didn't walk, he strode, an apex predator surveying his feeding ground. Trailing him were 3 older Japanese men. They moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that made Vance's aggressive energy seem all the more jarring. The eldest, a man with a shock of white hair and eyes that held the deep, patient wisdom of a 1,000-year-old forest, was clearly the leader. Clara noticed the small embroidered crest on his cufflinks, a stylized Polonia flower. The Go-san no Kiri, a venerable family, Mon. This was a man of tradition, of history. This was Mr. Ishikawa. Clara took a deep, steadying breath. Be a ghost, she told herself. Fill the glass. Take the order. Disappear. She approached the table as they were being seated. Vance was already in mid-monologue, his voice a sharp, percussive instrument that sliced through the restaurant's decorum. And the beauty of the synapse model is its aggressive scalability. We're not just archiving the past, we're predicting the future of sentiment. It's a paradigm shift, gentlemen. He gestured for them to sit, not with a welcoming hand, but with a sharp, impatient flick of his fingers. Clara stepped into the brief pause. Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Clara, and I will be your server this evening. May I begin with some water for the table? Vance didn't look at her. He was already tapping furiously at his watch, the light from its screen casting a ghoulish glow on his face. Still water for them, sparkling for me, and tell the sommelier to bring the 82 Petrus. Don't even bother showing me the list, and be quick about it. My time is literally worth more than this entire restaurant. The insult was delivered with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. Clara's professional smile tightened, but it didn't break. Of course, sir. Immediately. She retreated, her cheeks burning. It was the casual dehumanization that stung the most, the reduction of her entire being to a simple function, an obstacle to a bottle of wine. As she passed the sommelier station, Jean-Pierre, a kind, world-weary Alsatian, gave her a sympathetic look. The barbarian is at the gates. Mon ami, be strong. From a distance, Clara watched the dynamic at the table unfold. It was not a negotiation. It was a siege. Vance dominated, his gestures expansive, his voice loud. He interrupted his guests, finishing their sentences, assuming their agreement. The Japanese men, in contrast, were models of restraint. They sat perfectly still, their hands folded, their faces impassive masks of politeness. But Clara, who had been raised around such men, saw the subtle cues Vance missed. The slight, almost imperceptible tightening of Mr. Ishikawa's jaw when Vance checked his watch for the 10th time. The way his senior aide's gaze would briefly flicker to the ceiling when Vance butchered the pronunciation of his name. Vance was not building a bridge. He was burning it, plank by plank, convinced the sheer force of his brilliance would compel them to leap across the chasm. When she returned with the water, pouring with a steady, practiced hand, Vance snapped his fingers. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet room. "Hey, you!" he barked, not even bothering to use a name. "Bread. Now. Do you understand the concept of now?" Clara paused, the bottle of Voss held perfectly still over the glass of Ishikawa's junior associate. "The bread course will be out momentarily, sir. It is baked to order." "Then tell them to order it faster," Vance sneered, finally deigning to look at her. His eyes were a pale, flat blue, the color of a frozen lake. They scanned her, catalogued her, black uniform, tired eyes, cheap shoes, and dismissed her. "And try to look a little more alive. Your funereal pace is killing the mood." She turned on her heel, her body a rigid line of control. In the sanctuary of the kitchen, she pressed her forehead against the cool, stainless steel of a prep table, her fists clenched so tightly, Her knuckles were white. She thought of her mother's smile, the rare moments of lucidity when she would whisper, "Anata wa watashi, no hokori desu." "You are my pride. Swallow it," she commanded herself. Swallow the anger. It doesn't pay for care. It doesn't buy peace. But as she returned to the dining room with the bread basket, she realized the atmosphere at table 7 had grown even colder. The Japanese men were now conversing quietly amongst themselves in their native tongue. Vance, utterly oblivious, was scrolling through his phone, a smirk on his face. He clearly assumed they were oohing and awing over his proposal. Clara approached the table, her movements silent. As she placed the basket of warm, artisanal bread in the center, she was close enough to hear them. And in that moment, the world shifted. She wasn't just a waitress who had once lived in Japan. She was a woman for whom the language was a second soul. She understood not just the words, but the nuance, the honorifics, the subtle dance of respect and implication that was invisible to the Western ear. "Kare no reigi no nasa wa shinjirarenai," the senior aide was murmuring to Ishikawa. "His lack of courtesy is unbelievable." Mr. Ishikawa replied, his voice low and smooth as polished river stone. "Osoi mizu wa fukai, nagare o kakusu." Slow water hides a deep current. Let us see what lies beneath his noise. Clara's heart skipped a beat. They were assessing him, testing him, and he was failing spectacularly. The dinner service became a slow-motion torture, an endless procession of exquisitely prepared dishes that were barely touched. With each course, Vance grew more impatient and drank more heavily. The 82 Petrus, a wine that deserved quiet contemplation, was being gulped down like cheap table wine. His arrogance, fueled by alcohol, began to curdle into outright recklessness. He believed the waitress was furniture. He believed his guests were captivated. He believed he was the smartest man in a world of fools. He decided, in a fit of what he surely thought was cultural outreach, to impress them. He raised his glass, sloshing a bit of the priceless wine onto the tablecloth. "Kanpai," he bellowed, the word mangled by his American accent. The Japanese men politely raised their glasses in response. Then, Vance leaned toward Mr. Ishikawa's junior associate, a young man who looked barely out of university. He gestured with his fork toward Clara, who was meticulously crumbing the table between courses. And then he spoke. He switched to Japanese, a clumsy, broken version he had likely memorized from a corporate training video. He thought he was being clever, building rapport by sharing a joke at the expense of the hired help. "Kono ningyo wa karapo desu ne," Vance said, a smug grin spreading across his face. "This doll is empty, isn't she?" He looked at his guests, expecting a shared laugh, a moment of masculine bonding between the powerful. The silence that fell upon the table was absolute. It was a profound, heavy silence that seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. In Japanese culture, service is an art form, a profession deserving of respect. To insult a server, especially one performing her duties with quiet dignity, was not just rude, it was a deep and unforgivable stain on one's own character. It revealed a soul that was, in fact, karapo, empty. But Vance, deaf to the nuances of their silence, mistook it for rapt attention. He pressed on, emboldened. He gestured to Clara again. "Kanojo no atama ni wa nanimo nai." There is nothing inside her head. He turned back to his own VP, who had joined them for dessert, and chuckled in English. "I'm telling them she's a total airhead. You've got to connect with them on their level, you know. It's all about respect." Clara stood frozen, the small silver crumber clutched in her hand. The blood was a roaring tsunami in her ears. She looked at Kalen Vance, this titan of industry, this self-proclaimed visionary, and saw him for what he was, a hollow man, a noisy child banging on a drum. She looked at Mr. Ishikawa. His face was a mask of granite, but she saw the deep shame in his eyes. Not for her, but for his host. The multi-billion-dollar deal was dying right here, next to the half-eaten lobster thermidor. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, go to the kitchen, breathe, finish the shift. Another day, another dollar toward her mother's care. To speak up would be professional suicide. Dubois would fire her on the spot. She would be blacklisted. The tips from this one table alone could cover her mother's medication for a month. But then she met Vance's eyes. He was looking at her, a smirk playing on his lips, waiting for her to finish her menial task so he could continue his performance. He genuinely believed she was an object, a doll with no thoughts, no feelings, no history. Something inside Clara Hayes, something that had been dormant for years, finally broke. It wasn't a loud, violent fracture, but the quiet, decisive click of a key turning in a long, rusted lock. It was the spirit of her father, the pride of her heritage, the simple, undeniable truth of her own worth. She finished crumbing the table, her movements economical and precise. She stepped back from the table, straightening to her full height. She was no longer a ghost. She was a presence. She drew the focus of all four men. She looked directly at Kalen Vance. The din of the restaurant seemed to fade into a distant hum. Then she bowed. Not the submissive, hurried bob of a servant, but a deep, formal, and perfectly executed ojigi, the bow of an equal, held for 3 full seconds. She rose slowly, her eyes locking with his, and she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it filled the space around them. It was low, clear, and pitched in the flawless, high-register Japanese of the Tokyo aristocracy, a language of poetry and power that Vance's clumsy phrasebook Japanese could never hope to imitate. "Vance-sama," she began, the honorific dripping with a terrifying, formal irony. "Karapo no ningyo de wa naku, kokoro no aru ningen de gozaimasu." Mr. Vance, I am not an empty doll, but a human being with a heart. Vance's smirk froze on his face, a rictus of confusion. His brain was struggling to catch up, to process the impossible reality that the furniture was speaking. Clara did not stop. She turned her gaze to Mr. Ishikawa, her expression softening with genuine respect. "Ishikawa-sama," she said, her voice now carrying the warmth and sincerity Vance so conspicuously lacked. She gestured subtly toward the untouched bread basket. "Osorerimasu ga, okyaku-sama no sonkei o shiranai kata to no shokuji wa, aji no nai pan o taberu yona mono de gozaimasu." Mr. Ishikawa, I humbly apologize, but dining with a man who does not understand respect for his guests is like eating bread that has no flavor. She paused, letting the weight of the word settle. Then, for the final devastating blow, she turned her eyes back to the stunned billionaire. Her voice was now as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Soshite, Vance-sama," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Kara no utsuwa wa, motomo ukina oto o tateru to imasu." And Mr. Vance, they say the empty vessel makes the loudest sound. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical entity, a crushing weight that pressed down on the entire dining room. It was the sound of a universe being reordered. Mr. Ishikawa's eyes, which had been wide with astonishment, slowly crinkled at the corners. A look of profound, undisguised admiration bloomed on his face. He had come to New York to witness a demonstration of modern technology, but had instead been treated to a masterclass in ancient honor. Kalen Vance sat paralyzed, his face cycling through a kaleidoscope of emotions: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, a volcanic, blotchy rage. The waitress, the doll, had not only understood him, she had dismantled him, piece by piece, with a grace and precision he could never comprehend. She had corrected him, insulted him, and apologized to his guests for his behavior, all in a language he had tried to use as a weapon against her. "What?" Vance finally choked out, his voice a strangled rasp. "What the hell did you just say to me?" Clara switched back to perfect, unaccented English. Her tone was the epitome of professional decorum, yet it carried a chilling finality. "I was merely offering your guests a more nuanced cultural perspective, sir," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "I have brought the bread. Will there be anything else?" She picked up her small silver tray, holding it not like a servant, but like a queen holding an orb. "Or perhaps you would like the check? I imagine this negotiation is concluded." The spell broke. The sound that erupted from Kalen Vance was not a word, but a primal roar of wounded pride. It was the sound of a god discovering he was mortal. He shot to his feet, sending his heavy oak chair crashing backward onto the marble floor. The bang echoed through Ethelgard like a thunderclap, causing every head in the restaurant to turn. "Manager!" Vance bellowed, his face a grotesque mask of fury, veins standing out on his neck like thick cords. "Get Dubois, now!" Clara did not retreat. She stood her ground, her spine a rod of steel. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but her expression remained one of serene, almost pitying, calm. She had already walked through the fire. There was no point in fearing the embers. Mr. Dubois appeared at the table side, as if summoned by a dark incantation, his face the color of ash. He had been lurking in the wings, sensing the impending disaster, and now it had arrived in all its terrible glory. "Mr. Vance, sir. Is there a problem?" "My deepest apologies for any," Dubois stammered, wringing his hand so hard his knuckles cracked. Vance jabbed a trembling finger toward Clara. The finger was inches from her face, but she didn't even blink. This nobody," he spat, the word laced with venom. "She just insulted me in front of my investors. She's speaking filth at my table. I want her fired. I want her thrown out on the street. I want her blacklisted so she can't even get a job washing dishes in a sewer." Dubois swiveled to face Clara, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and betrayal. The cardinal rule had been broken. The customer, especially a customer of Vance's magnitude, was always right. The truth was a luxury Ethelgard could not afford. "Hayes!" Dubois shrieked, his voice cracking. "What have you done?" "I provided a translation, Mr. Dubois," Clara said, her voice cutting through the hysteria with surgical precision. "Mr. Vance was attempting to build rapport with his guests in Japanese. I merely clarified his message to ensure there were no cultural misunderstandings." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "I believe in clear communication, especially in business." "She's lying!" Vance slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "She humiliated me. She called me empty." A flicker of understanding, quickly followed by fear, crossed Dubois' face. He knew Clara was sharp, quiet, and fluent in something other than English, but he also knew that Kalen Vance's corporate account was worth more than his entire year's salary. "You're finished, Hayes," Dubois hissed, his professional demeanor dissolving into raw panic. "Get your things from your locker and get out. You're trespassing." "It would be my pleasure," Clara said. With a slow, deliberate movement, she untied the strings of her apron. She folded it into a neat, crisp square and placed it gently on the back of Vance's fallen chair. It was a final, quiet act of defiance. She was leaving her servitude behind, but as she turned to go, A calm, authoritative voice cut through the air. Chotto mate kudasai. Please wait a moment. It was Mr. Ishikawa. He had remained seated throughout the entire chaotic exchange, a small island of tranquility in a sea of rage. Now he rose to his feet. He was not a tall man, dwarfed by Vance's lanky frame, but he possessed an immense, unshakable gravity that seemed to bend the room around him. He ignored Vance completely. He ignored Dubois. His gaze was fixed solely on Clara. He spoke, not in Japanese, but in careful, deliberate English. "Young woman," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "Your Japanese is not learned from a book. It has the cadence of the Yamanote line, the politeness of the imperial palace. Where did you acquire it?" Clara paused, surprised by the question, but found her voice. "My father was a cultural attaché, sir. I grew up in the Azabu district of Tokyo." A slow, knowing nod from Ishikawa. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Azabu," he murmured, as if tasting a fine, aged sake. "A place of dignity. Your father taught you well. He gave you a gift greater than any technology." Then, Ishikawa turned to face Kalen Vance. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, hard gleam of forged steel. "Vance-san," he said, the honorific now a weapon of dismissal. "My company has survived for 200 years. We have survived wars, earthquakes, and economic collapse. We have done so by building partnerships based on one thing: character. Jinkaku." Vance, sensing the deal slipping through his fingers, tried to recover with a blustering laugh. "Kenji, come on. It's a waitress. She got emotional. Let's not let a little staff issue derail a multi-billion-dollar future." "This is not a staff issue," Ishikawa said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than Vance's shouts. He signaled to his two aides, who rose in silent, perfect unison. "This is a character issue. A man who cannot show basic respect to the person pouring his water will never show true respect to a business partner when difficulties arise. You do not see people. You see objects, dolls, tools to be used." Vance's jaw hung open. You're walking away? Over her? This is a $10 billion valuation." "No," Ishikawa corrected him gently as he buttoned his suit jacket. "We are walking away because of you. She did not cost you this deal." He paused, looking at Clara with profound respect. "She saved us from it." Ishikawa turned back to Clara. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a slim, elegant business card. He held it out to her not with one hand, but with two, the ultimate gesture of respect in Japanese culture. "My company is establishing its North American headquarters here in New York," he said. "We will require a director of cross-cultural relations, someone who understands that a bridge is built not with numbers, but with honor. Should you find yourself seeking new employment, my office would be honored to receive your call." Clara's hand trembled as she took the card. The crisp, embossed paper felt heavier than a bar of gold. "Arigatou gozaimasu, Ishikawa-sama," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Ishikawa." The Japanese delegation turned and walked toward the exit, their footsteps silent on the marble floor. They left Kalen Vance standing alone at the wreckage of his table, the spotlight of the entire restaurant's attention burning down on him. He looked around, his eyes wild, seeing nothing but a sea of staring, judging faces. His rage, having no other target, swiveled back to the source of his humiliation. "You!" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouts. "You have no idea what you've just done. I will destroy you. You will be a ghost for the rest of your life. You hear me? A nobody." Clara looked at him, at the pathetic, crumbling ruin of a man who, moments before, had thought he was king of the world. All her fear was gone, replaced by a vast, cool pity. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear and loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I was earning $17 an hour to finance my mother's end-of-life care while being treated like an object by men like you. My life was already hard. You can't ruin me. I have nothing left for you to take." She held up the business card. "But you, I think you just lost everything." She turned and walked away, not looking back. She held her composure as she pushed through the kitchen doors. She held it as she passed the stunned dishwashers and line cooks. She held it as she cleaned out her locker. It was only when she burst through the rear service entrance into the grimy, rain-slicked alley, surrounded by the stench of garbage and stale grease, that Clara Hayes finally leaned against the cold brick wall, slid to the ground, and allowed herself to weep. Not from fear or regret, but from the terrifying, earth-shattering release of a lifetime of swallowed pride. The journey home on the F train was a surreal purgatory. The train rattled through the dark tunnels under the East River, its flickering lights illuminating the tired, impassive faces of the city's late-night commuters. Clara sat huddled in a corner, the precious business card clutched in her hand, her mind a maelstrom of triumph and terror. One moment, she felt a soaring, incandescent pride. The next, a crushing wave of panic. She had stood up to a bully, yes, but she was also unemployed. The memory care facility was not interested in moral victories. They accepted payment in the form of cold, hard cash. When she finally unlocked the 3 deadbolts on her apartment door, the scent of lavender and old paper greeted her. The apartment was small, but it was immaculate. On a small table by the window, a single lamp cast a warm glow on a framed photograph of her and her parents under the great torii gate of the Meiji Shrine. Her father was young and handsome, her mother vibrant and laughing. It felt like a picture of a different family from a different world. A soft sound came from the bedroom. She pushed the door open to find her mother, Eleanor, sitting on the edge of the bed, folding a single hand towel over and over again with meticulous, unseeing care. Eleanor's Alzheimer's had stolen her past and her future, leaving her adrift in a confusing, perpetual present. "Mum?" Clara said softly. Eleanor looked up, her blue eyes, so like Clara's, clouded with confusion. For a moment, there was no recognition. Then, a faint glimmer. "Clara, dear, you're home from the library so late." She thought Clara was still in college. Some days, she thought Clara was her own sister. "Just got in, Mum," Clara said, forcing a cheerful tone as she knelt and took her mother's hands, stilling their restless motion. It was a busy night. She couldn't tell her. She couldn't add the burden of her unemployment to the chaos in her mother's mind. She helped her mother into bed, humming a Japanese lullaby her father used to sing to them, a simple tune about a dragonfly. Eleanor's breathing softened, and she drifted into a restless sleep. Clara retreated to the tiny kitchen, her victory at the restaurant feeling hollow and distant now. She opened her laptop. The balance in her checking account was $814. 7 lats. The monthly bill for the memory care facility, which she'd been putting off, was over $6,000. It was due in 10 days. For the next 48 hours, Clara existed in a state of suspended dread. She polished her old resume, the line item, Linguistics Scholar, Columbia University, incomplete, mocking her with what might have been. She applied for everything: translator positions at faceless corporations, administrative assistant jobs, even other high-end waitressing gigs, knowing her name was likely already poison in that small, incestuous world. The replies were a uniform, deafening silence. On the third day, her phone began to buzz, and then it didn't stop. A cascade of notifications, texts from friends she hadn't spoken to in years, a flood of friend requests on a Facebook profile she'd all but abandoned. Confused, she opened a text from her old college roommate, Sarah. It contained a single link and the words, "OMG Clara, is this you?" She clicked the link. It took her to a Twitter post. The video was shaky, obviously filmed on a phone from a nearby table, but the audio was terrifyingly clear. It had been uploaded by a food blogger who happened to be dining at Ethelgard that night. The caption read, "Tech CEO Kaylin Vance gets a lesson in class from a waitress with a PhD in karma. Must watch." The video had 17 million views. Clara watched, her heart pounding, as the entire drama played out again. Vance's sneering Japanese, her quiet, devastating reply, the collective gasp of the nearby diners, Mr. Ishikawa's dignified exit. It was all there. She scrolled through the comments, her hands trembling. "The empty vessel makes the loudest sound. Savage! This woman is my hero. Synapse stock, SORN, is down 8% in pre-market trading. The Ishikawa deal is officially dead. Someone find this waitress and give her a crown and a CEO position. Her Japanese is unbelievably beautiful. That's not something you learn on Duolingo." A dizzying, disorienting vertigo washed over her. She wasn't just Clara Hayes' unemployed daughter anymore. She was Ethelgard Waitress, a viral sensation, a symbol of working-class defiance. But viral fame is a fickle, dangerous beast. It doesn't pay the rent, and sometimes it awakens monsters. Her phone rang, a blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. "Is this Clara Hayes?" The voice was cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Who's calling?" "My name is Julian Croft. I'm senior counsel for Vance Industries. We are aware of the illegally recorded and deceptively edited video that is circulating online. I'm calling to inform you that you are in breach of the non-disclosure agreement you signed upon your employment at Ethelgard. If you make any public statement, speak to any media outlet, or attempt to profit from this incident in any way, we will pursue litigation to the fullest extent of the law. We will sue you for defamation, for tortious interference, and for breach of contract. We will take your apartment, your savings, and every dollar you ever hope to earn. Is that clear?" The blood drained from Clara's face. "I didn't post that video. I didn't talk to anyone." "It doesn't matter," Croft snapped. "You created the incident. Stay silent. Disappear. It's your only viable option." The line went dead. Clara sank onto a sofa, the phone slipping from her numb fingers. The brief moment of public vindication vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the situation. She was a woman with $800 to her name. Kaylin Vance was a man who could afford to keep an army of lawyers on retainer just to crush people like her. He would bury her. She looked at her mother's sleeping form, at the unpaid bills on the table. The lawyer was right. Her only option was to disappear. She curled up on the couch, pulling a thin afghan over her shoulders, and stared at the dark screen of her raw. The phone lay dark and silent on the coffee table, an obsidian slab of judgment. For 3 days, it had been Clara's tormentor. In the first 24 hours after the video went viral, it had been a source of dizzying, terrifying validation. Texts from friends, long-lost cousins, even the barista at her local coffee shop, all flooded in with messages of awe and support. She was a folk hero, a digital David who had felled a tech Goliath with a well-aimed proverb. The hashtag #AllThatEmptyVessel was trending worldwide. For a fleeting, incandescent moment, she had felt powerful. Then had come the call from Julian Croft, Kalen Vance's senior counsel. His voice, a sterile instrument of intimidation, had surgically excised that power, replacing it with a cold, paralytic dread. He didn't just threaten, he anatomized her ruin. He spoke of asset seizure, of wage garnishment in perpetuity. He mentioned her mother's medical history, a chilling implication that they knew her precise point of vulnerability. "We will make an example of you, Ms. Hayes," he had concluded, his tone as flat as a tombstone. "We will ensure the cost of your 15 minutes of fame is a lifetime of silent regret." Now the silence from the phone was worse than the noise. The viral tide was already receding, chasing a new spectacle. Kalen Vance's PR machine, a multi-million-dollar behemoth, had awakened. Pundits on financial networks began to murmur about a carefully orchestrated corporate espionage attempt. Anonymous sources painted a picture of a volatile, emotionally unstable waitress with a history of disciplinary issues. Her heroism was being systematically dismantled and reassembled into a cautionary tale. She was no longer David. She was an unhinged saboteur. And in the face of this onslaught, the world was moving on. Clara sat huddled on her worn sofa, the thin Afghan a poor defense against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Her laptop was open, the screen displaying her bank balance, $743.99. The bill for her mother's care facility, now a week overdue, lay on the table like a warrant for her arrest. Every job application she had sent out had been met with a wall of silence. She was radioactive. She looked at the small, elegant business card from Ishikawa Industries. It sat next to her father's worn copy of The Tale of Genji, a stark contrast of modern potential and ancient comfort. In the first flush of defiance, it had seemed like a key. Now it looked like a trap. To use it would be to confirm Vance's narrative that she was an opportunist who had staged the entire incident. It would be the provocation Croft had warned her about. They would descend upon her, a legion of lawyers in $1,000 suits, and they would grind her into dust. To be a ghost was to survive. To reach for the light was to be annihilated. Her mother stirred in the next room, a soft, confused murmur. Clara rose, her joints aching from tension, and went to her. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her hands twisting the edge of the blanket. "The tickets," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on a point in the distant past. "Did your father remember the tickets for the No play?" "He always forgets." "He has them, Mum," Clara said, her voice a soothing balm over the raw wound of her own fear. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her mother's restless hands in her own. "They're right here. We won't be late." Eleanor's gaze drifted to Clara's face, a flicker of lucidity in the fog. "You look so tired, my love. Is everything all right at the embassy?" The embassy. Her father's world. A world of dignity, of quiet diplomacy, of battles won, not with shouting but with precisely chosen words. A world that felt as distant as the moon. "Everything's fine, Mom," she lied, stroking her mother's thin, papery skin. "Just a long day of translation." As she tucked her mother back in, humming the old lullaby about the red dragonfly, the lie she had just told echoed in her mind. Translation. That was what she had done. She had translated Vance's boorishness into the language of honor. She had translated disrespect into consequence. Her father had not raised her to be a ghost. He had given her a voice, 2 of them, in fact, and she had spent the last 6 years silencing them both in the name of survival. She looked at her reflection in the dark bedroom window. She saw the tired eyes, the pallor of fear. She saw the ghost Julian Croft wanted her to be. And for the first time in days, a spark of anger, pure and hot, burned through the fog of her despair. Caelan Vance had tried to erase her, to define her as an empty doll. Now his lawyer was ordering her to complete the job herself. She would not. Returning to the living room, she sat before her laptop, not with hope, but with a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She was a mouse cornered by a lion, yes, but the mouse still had a choice. It could cower and wait for the inevitable, or it could make a sound. She would not call Mr. Ishikawa. A call was a plea. She would write. A letter was a testament. She began to type, her fingers moving with a precision she hadn't felt in years. This would not be an email asking for a job. It would be a final report, a diplomat's correspondence from a finished battle. She composed it in English first, a simple, formal letter. She thanked him for his conduct at the restaurant. She expressed her profound admiration for the principle of jinkaku, of character, that he had so clearly demonstrated. She made no mention of her own situation, of the video, of her unemployment. She spoke only of her respect for his actions. Then came the true work. She began translating her own letter into Japanese. This was not a simple conversion of words. It was an act of cultural immersion. She painstakingly selected the correct forms of keigo, the honorific language that elevates the recipient and humbles the speaker. Every verb, every noun, every particle was a choice, a brush stroke in a portrait of respect. She wrote not as a desperate job seeker, but as her father's daughter, a custodian of the bridge between two cultures. It was the most important translation of her life. She attached her resume, renaming the file Clara Hayes, Introduction.pdf. It was not an application. It was a formal presentation of her history, a context for the person who was writing. She stared at the completed email for a long time. The subject line read simply, "With deepest respect, a correspondence from Clara Hayes." Her finger hovered over the send button. This was it. The sound, the roar of the mouse. She closed her eyes, saw her mother's face, and clicked. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of dread, but of anticipation. A held breath. For 48 hours she refreshed her inbox obsessively. Nothing. The PR campaign against her intensified. An article appeared in a business journal titled "The Ethelgard Ambush: How Corporate Rivals Weaponize Service Staff." It didn't name her, but it didn't have to. The narrative was solidifying. She was a pawn, a fraud. The world had rendered its verdict. Hope began to fray. On the third day, a reply came. It was not from Chairman Ishikawa. It was from Asato Akemi, office of the chairman. The email was brief, formal, and written in flawless Japanese. Hayes-sama. The chairman has received your correspondence. He appreciates your sentiments. He is currently occupied with the establishment of our North American headquarters and will be unavailable for the foreseeable future. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Clara read it once, then twice. The polite, impenetrable wall of Japanese corporate formality. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. It was the most elegant, soul-crushing rejection she had ever received. It was over. She had made her sound, and the universe had responded with a polite, "No, thank you." The lion had not even bothered to roar back. It had simply ignored her. A wave of nausea and despair so profound it felt like drowning washed over her. She closed the laptop, the faint click of the lid sounding like a coffin sealing shut. For a week, Clara drifted. She sold her father's collection of vintage jazz records to a shop in the village for enough money to pay another month at the care facility. She started applying for jobs again, this time for overnight stocking at grocery stores, for cleaning services, anything that required no name, no background check, only a willingness to be invisible. She was preparing for the life Julian Croft had promised her. Then, late on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, her phone buzzed. A New York number she didn't recognize. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Annoyed, she answered, ready to snap at a telemarketer. "Clara Hayes." The voice was female, with a crisp, precise accent that was a subtle blend of Tokyo and Oxford. "Yes?" "This is Akemi Sato. I am the acting head of North American operations for Ishikawa Industries. I trust you received my previous email." Clara's throat went dry. Yes, I did." "Good," Ms. Sato said, her tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "The chairman has a belief. He says that a person who builds a perfect wall is either hiding something, or they are testing to see who has the courage to knock on the gate. Your letter was a perfect wall. It asked for nothing, which, in his estimation, meant you needed everything. Your silence since my reply has been noted." Clara was speechless. It had been a test, a con. "We are conducting interviews for a senior position at our new headquarters," Miss Sato continued, her voice all business. "Director of Cultural Liaison. The role requires absolute fluency in language, nuance, and character. It is a position of immense trust. We have interviewed 37 candidates from the top consulting firms in the world. None have been satisfactory. The chairman has instructed me to add one more name to the list. Be at our temporary offices tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. A car will be waiting for you at 8. The line went dead before Clara could even respond. The next morning, stepping out of the black town car and into the lobby of a gleaming midtown skyscraper felt like entering another dimension. Dressed in her only suit, retrieved from the back of her closet, and smelling faintly of mothballs, she felt like an imposter. The Ishikawa offices were a sanctuary of minimalist calm. No shouting traders, no frantic energy. Just the quiet hum of purpose. Akemi Sato met her in the reception area. In person, she was even more formidable, a woman in her late 40s, with eyes that seemed to see not just Clara, but her entire history of doubt and fear. The interview was a crucible. It began with Sato and 2 senior executives. They dissected her resume in English, questioning the 7-year gap where she had been a waitress. They didn't judge. They simply probed. "Describe the conflict resolution skills you developed managing complaints at Ethelgard," one asked. "Explain the logistical efficiencies you observed in their supply chain," said another. They were reframing her servitude as a field study in business operations. Then, without warning, they switched to Japanese. They presented her with a case study. A multi-million-dollar robotics contract with a factory in Ohio was on the verge of collapse. The American engineers felt the Japanese team was slow and indecisive. The Japanese team felt the Americans were disrespectful and rushed. "You have 1 week to save this deal, Hayes-san," Sato said, her gaze sharp. "What is your plan?" Clara took a breath. This was the world her father had navigated. She spoke of the Japanese concept of nemawashi, the informal, behind-the-scenes consensus building. She proposed separate informal dinners with both teams, not to talk about the contract, but to build personal relationships. She suggested bringing a master of the tea ceremony to the Ohio factory, not as a gimmick, but as a practical demonstration of how precision, patience, and ritual can lead to a perfect outcome. She wasn't just translating words. She was translating worldviews. For 3 hours they grilled her. They tested her, pushed her, laid traps of etiquette and nuance that she carefully, respectfully sidestepped. Finally, the 2 executives bowed and left the room, leaving her alone with Akemi Sato. "You are a surprise, Hayes-san," Sato said, pouring them both a cup of green tea from a simple iron pot. "Your file says you are a waitress, but you speak with the mind of a diplomat." "I've been a diplomat's daughter longer than I've been a waitress," Clara replied quietly. Sato took a slow sip of tea. "There is one final matter, a significant one. We have, of course, been following the media campaign against you. Kalen Vance is a vindictive man with deep pockets. Hiring you is not a simple personnel decision. It is a public statement. He will interpret it as an act of aggression. He will sue you, and he will sue us. His lawyers will attempt to bury our operations in frivolous litigation before we even begin. It will be expensive, exhausting, and ugly. Tell me," she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Clara's, "why are you worth that kind of trouble?" This was the real question. The final gate. The truth was, she wasn't worth it. She was a waitress with a sick mother, but her father's daughter was. "Because this isn't about me," Clara said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. "This is about the principle Mr. Ishikawa demonstrated in that restaurant. It's about Jinkaku. If a company like Ishikawa Industries, with its 200-year history of honor, allows a bully like Kalen Vance to dictate who it can and cannot hire through threats and intimidation, then the principle is meaningless. It's just a word in a brochure. Your trouble isn't hiring me. Your trouble begins if you don't hire me, because it proves that his noise is, in fact, more powerful than your silence. I am not asking you to take on this trouble for my sake. I am suggesting it is essential to take it on for yours." A long, profound silence filled the room. Akemi Sato stared at her, her expression unreadable. Then, for the first time, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "The car will take you home, Hayes-san," she said. "Your employment contract will be delivered by courier this evening." The contract was more than a lifeline. It was a new reality. The salary was a number that seemed to belong to someone else's life. The benefits package included a provision for comprehensive elder care that made Clara weep with relief. But one clause stood out. Ishikawa Industries fully indemnifies Ms. Hayes against any and all legal action taken by her previous employers or their associates in relation to events preceding her employment with the company. They weren't just hiring her. They were offering her sanctuary. As predicted, 2 days after the press release announcing her appointment, the lawsuit landed. Vance versus Ishikawa Industries and Clara Hayes. It was a sprawling, vindictive document, alleging everything from corporate espionage to intentional infliction of emotional distress. The media frenzy was immediate. But this time, Clara was not alone. Ishikawa's legal team, a phalanx of the most respected lawyers in New York, met the attack with a calm, surgical precision. They filed a motion to dismiss, calling the lawsuit a transparently frivolous attempt to intimidate a business competitor and harass a private citizen. Mr. Ishikawa himself issued a single public statement. "In America, I have learned, you have a saying, a man is known by the company he keeps. At Ishikawa Industries, we believe a company is known by the people it keeps. We stand with Miss Hayes." The battle raged in the press and the courts for months, but Vance's attack, born of rage rather than strategy, began to backfire. His obsessive crusade against a former waitress started to look less like a legitimate grievance and more like the unhinged tantrum of a spoiled billionaire. Investors, already wary after the collapse of the robotics deal, grew nervous. The stock of Synapse, once a Wall Street darling, began a slow, terminal decline. Clara, shielded from the worst of the storm by the corporate fortress around her, poured herself into her work. She became the essential bridge, the human algorithm that translated not just language, but intention, culture, and honor. She thrived. One crisp autumn afternoon, 6 months into her new life, she left the office early. She drove a car, her car, out of the city, toward the rolling green hills of Westchester. She pulled up to a beautiful, ivy-covered building that looked more like a university college than a medical facility. This was the gardens at Northwood, and it was her mother's new home. She found Eleanor not in her room, but in the sun-drenched central conservatory, sitting with an art therapist, painting watercolors of a Japanese rock garden. She was calm, focused, happy. "Clara, darling," she said, looking up as Clara approached. Her eyes were clear. The fog was gone. Clara knew these moments were fleeting gifts, islands of lucidity in a vast, forgetting sea, and she cherished them with a fierce, desperate love. "Hi, Mom," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion as she knelt beside the wheelchair. "I came to see you." Eleanor reached out and cupped Clara's face in her hand, her thumb gently tracing her cheek. She looked at Clara's tailored suit, her confident posture, the quiet peace in her eyes that had been absent for so long. "Your father," Eleanor said, her voice a soft, certain whisper. "He would be so proud of you." She switched to the Japanese that had been the secret, intimate language of their family. "Anata wa watashi no hokori desu." You are my pride. And there, in the quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by the scent of paint and blooming flowers, Clara finally received her true reward. The job, the money, the victory over Vance, they were just the means to this end. This single, priceless moment of recognition. A year later, Clara was leading a meeting with a German engineering firm in the main Ishikawa boardroom. The negotiations were tough, the cultural divide wide. But Clara moved between the two sides with the effortless grace of a master weaver, spinning threads of understanding, building a bridge of mutual respect. During a short break, she stood by the window overlooking the city. Her gaze fell upon the calligraphy that dominated the reception area, visible even from the boardroom. "Kara no utsuwa wa, motomo ukina, oto o tateru." The empty vessel makes the loudest sound. Her assistant entered and quietly handed her a tablet. "Ms. Hayes, this just came across the news wire. I thought you might want to see." The headline was from a society gossip site. "Disgraced tech mogul, Kalen Vance, spotted bussing tables at Hampton's fundraiser." There was a blurry photo, a gaunt, haunted-looking man in a cheap black uniform, clearing away plates. His billions were gone, lost to lawsuits and a company that had crumbled without its blustering figurehead. His noise had faded, leaving behind only a pathetic, hollow echo. Clara felt a surprising pang, not of triumph, but of pity. He had been so desperate to prove he wasn't empty that he had become nothing but a vessel for his own rage. She handed the tablet back. "Thank you, Kenji. That won't be necessary." She turned back to the window. She was no longer a ghost, nor a doll, nor a viral sensation. She was a presence, a voice. But she had learned the most profound lesson of all from Mr. Ishikawa, that the most powerful voice is often the one that chooses its moments of speech with infinite care, that understands the resonant power of a dignified silence. She had won her war, not by becoming louder than her opponent, but by becoming more substantial. Mr. Ishikawa entered the room, preparing to resume the negotiation. He caught her eye and gave a slight, respectful bow. "Shall we continue, Clara-san?" he asked. Clara smiled, a genuine, confident smile that reached her eyes. She had found her place. She was no longer translating words. She was translating worth, and she had finally, truly, found her own. "Yes," she said, her voice calm and clear. Let's begin.